Hello and welcome to this episode of Digitally. As we go deeper into data in the enterprise, the ethical choices we're making today and how we collect, how we use, how we interpret data are no longer in the abstract. They're operational, they're strategic, and they're deeply human. And nowhere is this tension more visible than in the trade-off, for instance, between personalization and bias. Just exactly where is the line between the two so that it's just enough but not too much. And so in today's conversation, I wanted to unpeel this balance and really get into this trade-off between personalization and fairness and what does it truly mean to be intentional about data ethics. And so to do that, as always, I brought in an amazing leader, and I'm thrilled to be joined by, because she's operated at the intersection of data, of product innovation, and services operations on the front lines of designing data-driven systems across industries. Our guest today is Melissa McSherry. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be here, Sanjay.
Thank you for joining us. We're going to go right into it. There's so much concern, there's so much discussion about ethics and AI. And I actually want to start on the positive side first. And so tell us a little bit about how does actually AI help in getting better ethical outcomes? Let's start there.
You know, I think one of the things I find really exciting about generative AI is the potential for the lower cost of content creation actually to lead to more inclusion. So that may sound a little bit counterintuitive, so let me sort of talk through, peel that apart. So as an example, I see these hyper-targeted skincare ads in my Instagram feed, all with the messaging that this is for older women worried about their wrinkles. And that makes sense because they have a product, and probably the largest market for them is fair-skinned women in their 50s or 60s or whatever. And so they put together messaging for that group, and with Instagram's help, they show it to just us. Like, this is targeting and personalization. I have a product and a message, and I find the people I think that product and message are relevant to. But there's two things about this. First of all, me personally, don't actually find the way that they talk to me to be especially compelling, because I kind of like facts and science, and they spend all this time talking about how life-changing having fewer wrinkles is for some random woman in Arizona. It's not that compelling. And the second thing is, I am certain, based on the messaging, the visuals, they are not showing these ads to young men. But the thing is, we should be talking in an effective way to young men about skincare, and specifically sunscreen, because they use it at lower rates than women, and men get skin cancer at higher rates than women. And in fact, you're going to love this, John Cena, 17-time WWE wrestling champion, is the new face of a Neutrogena campaign, in part because he had multiple skin cancers, and he has a goal of getting more men to use sunscreen to prevent skin cancer. Wow. So I imagine a world where fewer men actually get skin cancer, both because it's John Cena specifically telling them to put on their sunscreen, but also because we use generative AI to have him say it in a bunch of different ways with much lower production costs than actually having him film a bunch of campaigns. So for some guys, he shares the science, and for other guys, he says, do I be awesome like me, or whatever. But today, we're limited by his time and how expensive it is to actually get a film crew and produce these campaigns. And I think in the future, it actually makes much more economic sense to include more people and make it more relevant to them, because AI lowers the cost of creating the actual message. You can generate, you have his visual, you can just generate a video without him actually having to be.
What a great example. Yeah. Because I think what you really just said is, look, there's all this concern about it, but actually the ability to actually have the data and segment it thinly, and then the cost of producing content goes down with generative AI, gives you the ability to be hyper-personalized. And in so doing, you can now bring it to a more inclusive population.
Yes, exactly. And it's not just that you can be hyper-targeted about it. You actually, the content creation part means that you can create content you otherwise would not have created. And so, if you sort of scale this up to some places where we are trying to drive more inclusion, like homeownership or higher education or healthcare, I hope that leads to messaging and visuals and the whole package that leads to previously underrepresented groups really imagining themselves belonging and understanding that we intend for them to belong. Like, I want them to see themselves in the product because we created a message and a visual that puts someone just like them in the product, which may not be happening as much as we like.
I love that. It's truly it's such a big positive. Yeah. But let's just pick that up a little bit, and I want to push the point.
Yeah.
I want to push that by basically saying, listen, at the same time, that kind of hyper-targeting can actually introduce some biases in algorithms, particularly for unintentional use and other things.
Yeah.
So how do you, as an operator, as a practitioner, as someone who executes on these things,
Yeah.
how do you make sure that you manage through that?
So you are absolutely right. And I think that if there's a bunch of risk here, like, look, there's risk in everything, but there's a bunch of risk here, especially if we let existing implicit bias and stereotypes creep into our efforts. This could actually drive more segregation rather than more inclusion, because if it just amplifies what we're doing, if we're trying to do something good, it can amplify the good thing, but if not so much, then amplify the bad thing. And I think that risk is one of the reasons I think it is critical, absolutely, like one thing that people could take away, critical, that we focus on outcomes, specifically outcomes to customers, not just the inputs or just the type of tech we're using. So coming from financial services, I kind of grew up in a world where what actually happened mattered more than what you were trying to do. It's called disparate impact. And it basically said outcomes matter above all else, even if you weren't trying to do something nefarious. We have actually something like that in product safety. It's another place where this idea that what actually happens to consumers is a result of using the product matters, even if a manufacturer didn't have ill intent. And so my hope is, as we leverage this incredibly powerful tool set that AI is, that we will focus attention and, if it's needed, regulation, but for now just we'll focus attention on the outcomes rather than the process. So, I think AI gives us this great opportunity to include more people in financial services, great healthcare, education, a host of other areas. But if we end up excluding people, and frankly, if we exclude them either, for instance, because our data build sets are biased, and we all know that they are, and we all know that we need to control for that, or if we exclude them just because somebody had a really dumb strategy, like, oh, we should sell basketball shoes to black kids and calculators to Asian kids, which is like, who would do that? Either way, you let your customers down, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
Being incompetent to manage the known risks of using AI is not ever an excuse. Like, we have to measure what actually happens and say, we need to hold ourselves as practitioners and frankly the people we do business with who are using the technology and the tools and so on and so forth accountable for the actual outcomes to the customers.
Right.
We need to do it early and often.
I want to just take a 30-second and pause on that, because I think you've said something really, really strategic, and I just want to make sure I've got it absorbed in my head.
Yeah.
What you're trying to do is draw the distinction between output and outcome. And
Yes.
output is the end result of a machine learning algorithm. And outcome is the business outcome associated with achieving the goals you set out to do. And having clarity that you're actually shooting for outcomes, not output,
Yes.
is I think the lever you're giving us is the insight you're giving us. Is that right?
That is spot on. And the beautiful thing, and by the way, it's super tempting to focus on output because that's you control it, you see it, and it's just it's like, yeah, but that's my thing. Whereas the outcome, like, there's all these things that go into it, and there's a lot. It can feel like overwhelming. But the thing is, the benefit, one of the benefits of focusing on outcomes rather than intention is it frees us from making value judgments about people who maybe make an honest mistake. And let's be clear, we all make honest mistakes,
Of course
right?
you do.
Yeah, so many years ago, for instance, I had a colleague put together a series of pricing decisions to try to include more people with limited credit history in lower priced products. I mean, that's a great intention. Like, how awesome is that, right? Unfortunately, he didn't notice as he was doing it that the series of moves he made effectively lowered price for everyone in the set who was not an immigrant. Now, I am 5 nines of certain that he was not trying to discriminate against immigrants, in part because I just know he's a good guy, and in part because he himself was an immigrant. Like, it wasn't what he was trying to do. It was just a series of decisions, and he didn't see it. But fortunately, his colleagues, and incidentally, not compliance or a regulator or worst case, a plaintiff's attorney, right? His colleagues caught it before it went out because we were looking on the overall outcomes, not just intent, and so it didn't end up having a negative impact on consumers. So I think you're on any consumers, because it didn't end up going out. But I think you're spot on, Sanjay, that the temptation to focus on the part that I control or I run, you can't stop there. You have to focus on what actually happened to the customer.
So you like focusing on outcomes, if that's
do.
not really obvious.
Yeah, I do.
And then, look, you've been in positions where you've had to direct an organization to be able to do that. How do you mechanically set this up so that the entire team is tearing up and going after outcomes, not output? Because you said it's very easy to kind of be swayed by that.
I think it's such a great question. So and I think it's also it's in some ways sort of a way to include more people in the if you can get them focused on the outcomes as opposed to the output, it's a way to make this sort of more accessible to more people in the organization. So I think step one is you need to have some measure of what a good outcome is for a customer having used the product. But I think that one of the nice things about focusing on outcomes is that it actually can enable us to do a better job, even though, AI can be opaque to
Yeah.
a very large percentage of the population. So for instance, I mean, put it another way, like it's opaque, but it's not as opaque as like the human brain, right? And it's actually considerably more controllable. So again, using a lending
I
example.
want to pick this opaque thing a little bit more. So you
Yeah.
said something really interesting. It's opaque, but it's not as opaque. So tell us more about that.
Yeah. So this is one of the things I find so funny, or not funny, but it's just, I don't know, it's intriguing to me. So, people are like, oh, it's a black box. I don't know what's happening inside of it. All this stuff about like,
Yes.
the things that they're worried about or anxious about with AI. But many times the alternative is a person making a judgment. And the thing is, like, we think we know how we make our judgments. There is all of this neuroscience and like psychology research. It's, this guy named Danny Kahneman, who's an amazing economist and psychologist who won the Nobel Prize, behavioral economics, that tells us we have no idea like how we're making our decisions. We think we know, we do not know, right? And so, often I think AI, it's different, but it's not necessarily actually more difficult to understand or control. So, again, like a little lending example here. Long ago, humans basically made all decisions about loan applications called judgmental underwriting. And to be clear, there was a ton of discrimination. Like there's a reason that there's laws, and that was part of the reason why.
Right.
So one of the nice things about having a computer model make individual lending decisions is that if you don't like the pattern of outcomes, you can change the model. Like you can get in there and, move
Change
things.
the weights.
Exactly, change the weight. So, you can run a sample of 100,000 applications through the model before you start to use it on actual customers, and you don't like it, you tweak the model until you get the desired balance of outcomes in terms of inclusion, fairness, risk, for both the organization and for consumers. You cannot have a judgmental underwriter score 100,000 applications, decide that you don't like the way they just scored the applications, put them through training, and then have them score the same 100,000 applications to see how the training impacted them. And even if you could, it wouldn't be reliable because people do different things in training versus the real world. So I actually think when we focus on the systemic outcomes and what actually happened, there's a way for AI to make our decision making more predictable and more in line with our stated values, because getting a person to address implicit bias is really hard, while getting a model to address implicit bias, like you said, it kind of it's hard, but it kind of comes down to adjusting feature coefficients and weights. And so that's where this, this focus on, but what actually happens from the whole process of using judgmental underwriters versus the whole process of using a model, as opposed to just looking at, well, what are the output numbers that came out of the model, is I think where we need to start.
It's amazing because I think what you're saying is, while it might initially appear that we don't have as much quote unquote human control, in reality you have more control because you can change the weights.
Yeah.
Certainly you get it at scale, which is difficult for a human to do, but beyond the scale you actually have control. As long as you understand, and back to your point about you track outcomes, not output, then you're able to kind of feed that back into the quote unquote algorithms, and you kind of get it to correct itself, which is fantastic.
I think you have more control over the system. It may feel like you have less control over any one unit in the system, but the overall system, the pattern of impact on customers, I think you do have more control if you put in the work.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. Such great examples, by the way. Thank you for sharing that. I think the point you really are leaving at least me with is that a successful data and AI strategy isn't about the brilliance of the algorithms or the output, as we were talking earlier, or frankly the technical elegance of the data foundation and the weights in the algorithms. It's actually about understanding domain, the context, the business, and really being focused on outcome in the way you design this. And I think the piece I picked up from you is, it isn't just in the minds of the leader, it has to permeate through the organization. So
No, look, I think you're spot on. And I think that, it's not that there's not a role for technical brilliance, but that's not the hero. The hero is what happened to the customer, right? And so if you have something that's technically brilliant, that means that, for instance, think about fraud, right? I mean, I worked in fraud. Our North Star was every good transaction goes through, every bad transaction gets caught, and nobody ever knows it happened. It was just instantaneous. There's no friction, right? Now, of course, you're never going to like get all the way to that, but so there's a role for technical brilliance in getting you to that, but the point isn't the technical brilliance. The point is what happened to the person at the point of sale, which is they could always use their card for things legitimate, and they never had to deal with like, what is this thing on my, on my statement that's not me? So, if there's one thing that we could focus on, for me, it would be the measuring of the outcomes on customers as opposed to process outcomes. And I think it's hard work to set it up, but Sanjay, I'll say, I actually think it simplifies a lot of problems in the long run. For example, I acknowledge that AI can be pretty complicated for a lot of people to understand. Like, not everyone's going to get like vector mapping or neural network layers, or how do you turn words into numbers and generate a paragraph from that. But like, most people can understand at the end of the day, did more people get preventative health care? Did we have better racial balance in homeownership? And are more men using sunscreen, back to our thing at the beginning? And I think that the focusing on outcomes also cuts through a bunch of the noise around should we use this advanced technology or not, because at a certain point, if we have the ability to use a model that discriminates less than judgmental underwriters, if we have the ability to develop marketing that includes more people who've historically not been included, I think we have an obligation to use that ability. I mean, the status quo isn't right just because it's the status quo. And if we have the ability to deliver outcomes that are more just and more equitable and more fair using technology, I think we have to move with urgency to do it. And just one last little, if you'll permit me one little story. One last little point on this. So I think that this investment in keeping our eye on the outcomes ball, I don't think it's just about AI. My brother does some super, super technical work in privacy preventing algorithms for data analysis. And he made this really good point to me a number of years ago, that good statistical analysis should tell you something about the group but not be skewed by any individual, which is in essence what privacy preserving algorithms do. And so this thing that may initially seem like a loss of visibility because the privacy preventing algorithms like don't let you do certain things,
right,
actually ends up being a mathematical guarantee around more robust analysis when we focus on what the ultimate outcome and use of the work is. And so I guess if there were one thing that I would want my colleagues in technology and AI and data to focus on, just to raise everyone's ethical game, theirs and the people they work with, it's that we have to look at what actually happened, and did it make our customers' lives, and especially our most vulnerable customers' lives, especially that group, did it make their lives better? Like, what was the outcome, and how does it compare to the alternative? So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
I love it. What an amazing discussion, and if it wasn't clear already, you're all about outcomes. I love that.
Customer outcomes. What happened to the customer? Yes.
Thank you for joining us today, Melissa. It's such a pleasure.
It's such a pleasure. I thank you so much for having me, Sanjay. It's always such a delight to talk to you.